So our next speaker, who I'm really, really excited about today, is Shahroo Izadi. So Shahroo is a psychologist, behaviour change specialist, and best-selling author of The Kindness Method, the book that we have that we're giving away. Thank you, Shahroo. Drawing from the tools learnt whilst working in clinical addiction treatment, Shahroo designs toolkits, frameworks, and solutions that enable the most change-resistant individuals to create and sustain new behaviours against the odds and on their own terms. So Shahroo, I'm going to pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for having me. Yeah, just to echo that, my job in a nutshell is to work with the change resistant and to really work out, as an extension of what was just being discussed, why it is that people don't do the things that they would like to be doing, and after it's been accommodated for them externally. And so much of my job is working with someone to say, where is the resistance to change? And so what I thought would be most helpful is to hand over to you the questions that I use as a coach to elicit self-led change and to enable people to resolve ambivalence around change and to enable people to more broadly look at why they want to change personally. And what I've noticed is that a lot of the time there are groups of people for whom change becomes an incredibly personal process. And the reasons that they change and their motivators and their tipping points are very different to the ones that we assume and guess. And as such, what I want to hand over today is essentially a cheat sheet, if you will, of conversations that I would have with people who I know would like to make these changes to their behaviors, to their routines, and who I know have the resources and the objective capacity to do so, but who I know are not changing nonetheless. And what I hope to do is to be able to hand over the approach and the mindset and the sorts of conversations that one can have to really draw out and invite someone to draw out of themselves. Why is it, both in this context and in any context, why is it that despite knowing exactly what to do, despite wanting to do it, I'm not doing it? And so I'm here to talk about internal resistance. Next slide, please. And one of the first things that we talk about a lot in addiction is you really don't want to focus on what's bad about the behavior, what's bad about not changing. You want to look at what's good about staying the same way. That's where you get a really personal insight into why it is that people aren't changing. And you'll notice that things will come up like core beliefs from childhood. I'm the sort of person who starts things and doesn't finish them, so there isn't any point, or I won't be able to do it perfectly. There may be populations of people for whom all or nothing, perfectionism, ADHD diagnoses, which look at these traits also. There will be people for whom habit change and a disruption to routine will mean perfection, not progress. And so very often it's about asking people, why is it that, what could you risk experiencing, or what might happen if you do change? What bad things might happen to you if you do change? What do you stand to lose? What are you afraid will be disrupted? Because what this does is it enables people to really question their resistance from a personal place, and it enables them to feel empowered and not feel like, why am I not doing this? Is there something exclusively, uniquely wrong with me? As opposed to going, no, there's actually real reasons why there's resistance to change here. There are legitimate reasons why there's a friction. I am the sort of person who in many different domains often thinks, well, if I do nothing, nothing bad will happen. And so this sort of internal reflection can help enormously in that it gets the conversation going, but then the person can start to ask themselves in a more compelling way across their entire lives, if I take my focus off what's bad about the behavior that I don't want to be engaging in and really think about how it serves me to stay the same way, I may be able to get a real insight into barriers that are very personal to me. And a lot of the time, when we really target those, I may find that they're either outdated or don't apply anymore, or the discomfort involved in disrupting them is manageable to me. And so first of all, I would say, rather than focusing on what's wrong, let's talk about what's strong. What will be hard if you change? Why don't you want to change? Why would you prefer to stay the same way? And we always in addiction, we do this, because if you speak to someone who is engaging in an objectively unhealthy habit all day and they're dependent on it, for example, and you want to disrupt the status quo, as we want to do here, telling them about what's bad about them not changing is it doesn't help. Aside from anything else, it not being motivating, compassionate, they're aware. What's good about it invites them to really explore where that resistance is much more broadly, and it becomes about them. And I find that to be a much more compelling strategy. Next slide, please. Removing internal friction. Again, it can be incredibly helpful when trying to elicit behavior change and trying to bring about a new routine, to help people to zoom out more broadly and look at how they feel about setting routines, how they approach voluntary behavior change, what their patterns tend to be under these circumstances. And one of the things that is very compelling is to approach behavioral change as ultimately a conversation and a choice, over and over and over again. Now, whether that has to happen 15 or 15,000 times before it becomes a habit, whatever that habit may be, ultimately it comes down to, I say something that talks me in or out of making a difficult decision or not, that moves me in the direction that I want to go into. And when we do that, what we can do is to say, right, more broadly, when you want to change your habits, how are you speaking to yourself? When the adjustment period sets in, what gets personal? What do you say to yourself? And very often you'll notice that the responses that people give you will give you insight into the way that they operate across many of their behaviors. And whether it's the self-fulfilling prophecies, whether it's the thing they say to themselves. And so doing an audit of the way they speak to themselves and just generally asking someone, when you're adjusting to a new routine, how do you tend to be speaking to yourself? And a great way to kind of compare it is to say, right, if I was adjusting to it, how would you encourage me until it got easier? And so more and more, I would say, rather than saying, why aren't you doing this? It's about thinking, what conversation are you having with yourself when it gets hard? Assuming, of course, that whilst behavioral change is simple, it's not easy. And that's where it becomes personal. And that's where questions like this can help enormously with insight. Next, please. Zoom out. Building on that. Mastery is something that people often forget when they're building towards an outcome. And so a lot of the time, in the adjustment phases early on of a new habit or a new routine or getting on board with something that will require some adjustment on your part, it can be really hard to think about the point at which it'll become easier. And so looking at it as skill building can really help. And looking at the other things that you've adapted to. And so what can help enormously is thinking, what will this look like once it's easier? Because a lot of the time when we embark on these things, especially, all or nothing people like myself, we think about today. We think, gosh, that was hard. I'm not going to be able to do this forever. That was really complicated. Today didn't go right. And so what I would recommend is when you see that people are hitting points of friction or trying something once and going, well, that didn't work out because this didn't work out, or the weather, or my kids, or whatever else. It's about saying, first and foremost, do you believe that at the end of this, it will become easier? And that's when you start having the conversation of what adjustment should we factor in just because you're trying something new? And what does it look like when this is easy? What are you doing automatically? What's already set up? What's already flowing? And that makes it compelling because you're reminded that that first 10th, 15th time that you've disrupted the status quo with your daily routines isn't going to be that hard long term. But it's very interesting that when we feel that we haven't, when we feel that we've lagged behind and we've not built the habits that we want to build, it tends to get quite personal. And we think, well, here I am again, trying again. I'm the sort of person who doesn't start things. When actually we forget that it's skill building. The discomfort that you're feeling is the discomfort that you would feel if you were asked to wake up half an hour early because of a new job or anything else. And so I think more and more what you want to do is to zoom out and get that person thinking about how life is going to be better for them in the long term once these choices have become automatic. Next, please. Radical honesty. Now, I do a lot of work in anonymous sharing, self-reporting. And one thing that I've learned being in the work of, essentially change-resistant people telling me why they're not changing is that some of their reasons, the ones that would be really compelling for them to remember in that moment, their whys, if you will, are things that they're not proud of or that they don't think make any sense. Things like, oh, I want to prove to this person this, or I've always wanted to be this sort of person. I've never had a way of doing it. And ultimately, there will come a point of friction when a person is trying to build a habit, an internal friction that asks, will this be possible, etc. Why am I doing this? This is hard. Why am I doing this? What's the payoff? And I think that when the return, if you will, is more ambiguous, that means that the compelling statement, that the compelling response that they need to give themselves need to be even more powerful to why am I doing this? What's the point? This is too hard. And so what you really want to be doing is to have a response ready and have it be honest. I'm doing this because I want to say that I'm this. I want to do this because I want to voluntarily, I want to prove it to this, or I want to be this kind of person, whatever it is, right? What I want more and more is for you to be thinking, what's in it for me, honestly? What's my real reason? If I was about to quit on this, what could someone come in and say to me to talk me out of it? And it isn't going to be a generic thing. It isn't going to be, you can do this, you're amazing. It's going to be something that reminds me of what's in it for me personally. And so what I would say is, whether it's through conversation or whatever else, make it clear to people they don't need to tell you why they want to change, and they don't need to be your reasons. But if you can give them permission to change for whatever reason they like, extraordinary things can happen. Next slide, please. The next best choice. This is very important. I find that when I'm speaking with people, a lot of the time, they don't believe that they can change. And what they're saying is, I don't believe that I will arrive at the destination. So I should probably use a different example considering this particular domain that I'm speaking in, but they don't believe that they will achieve that goal and become that person, and that in the end, this will actually work out. And a lot of the time, that's because that's how they feel about a lot of long-term things, a lot of voluntary goals and difficulty and missions that they've put themselves on. And I often tell people, particularly when I'm working with them on habits that don't return for a while, exercise, etc. I often tell them that you don't, and bearing in mind that a lot of the time people have legitimately not achieved the thing that you're asking them to do before. They've not made it easy before. And so it feels patronizing to just be given these sort of cliched, you can do it, you'll get there, because we don't know that for sure. What I do think is helpful, though, is breaking down the process of getting to wherever you want to be. So in 6 months' time, I want my commute to look like this. Do I believe that I'll achieve that? No, that's fine. The steps to make it easy for that to be the case, the steps I need to take, how many times I need to make this tiny adjustment, or how many times I need to make that tweak, as long as you're noticing that those are getting easier, then that's all I need you to have faith in. And that's what I tell my clients. And so if you are in front of an employee who's saying or thinking, or you suspect that they're thinking, this isn't going to be realistic for me, I'm just not the kind of person who's going to keep this up, this isn't me, but I really want to do it, then I would say, right, well, what choices will you have to make easy in order for that to be the case? And are you capable of making those choices objectively? Each one of them. And often people will discover that the individual choices are completely manageable when they break them down. Like, yeah, I could do that, and then I could do that, and then I could do that. The problem comes when the internal pushback comes in. Some people will be looking at it from self-sabotage perspective. Some people will be looking at it from a perfectionism perspective, or there'll be a disruption. They will have been doing it really well, and then they'll go away, and the disruption will make them feel like they're not really into it anymore. Or a person who is involved in helping them to make it frictionless will not be involved anymore. Whatever else it is, what you really want to notice is bring it back down to, this is choice by choice by choice. You may not feel that you're capable of changing every day forever, but are you capable of making the next hard choice that moves you in the direction of your commute looking this way? If yes, then that's what I would reinforce. What's your next hard choice? What's going to be your next hard choice? Because I think a lot of the time what we do, and it's completely understandable, we reinforce how easy it is and how much we've accommodated the situation for someone. Look, we can do this. We've got these initiatives. These people are doing it. It's so easy. And sometimes what that does is really just reinforce to people, unfortunately, to some people, that despite everything, I'm still not doing it. And unfortunately, that reinforces the kind of thinking that's kind of holding us back here. And so more and more, you want to compel someone to see that the one choice that they're making on the spot, it's not a means to an end. It's an end in itself. My mission in these habits, in my professional life, with my friends, across my entire life, is to take the pressure off the outcome and just believe that I am capable of making the next best choice. And that becomes hard to push against when you speak to someone, because even if the self-belief is low, objectively speaking, the capacity is there. Next slide, please. Values and behaviors. What challenges have you taken on recently voluntarily? This is so important. I speak so frequently with people who will say that they do hard things for other people all the time, and that they have no problem doing hard things for other people. And there's an exercise in my book where I ask you to collect all of the things that you've done in the past that are hard. And very often people will find it difficult to write these things down and own them because they were forced to do those things. They'll say, yeah, but I had to do that. I had to step up. This person was poorly, or this thing had to be done, or this child, all of those things. But what I'm trying to say is that that's fine if you had to do it. It still demonstrated your capacity. And more what I've noticed is that unless people have taken on a challenge voluntarily and decided to make life hard for themselves, decided to care how they behave when no one's watching, then they don't find that they can internalize those accomplishments and the capacity that they've demonstrated because they had to. And so what I find can be really helpful is to ask someone, when did you last volunteer to do something hard for yourself? Just for you, just because you wanted to be this kind of person and do these kinds of things and make this kind of contribution, because it is hard. And I think a lot of the time, acknowledging that it's hard is actually very empowering. And not hard because there's something wrong with anyone, but hard because behavioral change is hard. Even if I was asking you to do something really lovely and really simple, it would be hard because it's a disruption of your status quo. And so one of the ways to really engage people is just to get them excited about doing hard things on purpose, really. Get them excited about pushing themselves and thinking, gosh, when was the last time I really pleasantly surprised myself in that sense? And that can help enormously, because what it does is it opens things up into a mindset. It opens things up into, what have I done that's hard for me lately? What have I done that's hard that I didn't have to do, or in the pursuit of making things easier for me? And so this idea of doing hard things becomes a compelling and exciting and optimizing one, as opposed to a remedial or punitive one, as is often the case for a lot of people because of their legacy when it comes to doing hard things. Next slide, please. Factor in resistance. When it comes to change, as many of you will know, there's never a right time. There's never a good time to do something hard. It's worth speaking to people about playing the tape forward and saying, right, if in 6 months' time you'd been doing this for this long, would that be better than the following 6 months? Do you wish you'd started 6 months ago? And what that gets people to do is to genuinely and discerningly identify what are the barriers that are always going to exist because they have to do with self-belief, whatever they have to do with. And what are the barriers that are what are the barriers that are moving? And so it is completely possible that in 6 months' time, it will be easier for you to do something. But it can be really helpful to know internally that that is what I'm waiting for, not for me to change, but for something else to change. Because I think this idea of I need to wait for me to change often lends itself to, now there's a new reason, now I'm not feeling this, because we're all stressed, we're all tired, all of it. So I think it's worth saying, really, if you're going to do this at some point, and it's legitimately not now, what are the conditions? What's the criteria for you? What will make it the right time to do something hard? And I don't think that should be given in any way a sort of like, I don't think people should be prodding themselves with that question. This is all about curious, compassionate inquiry. You want to do something, you're smart, you're capable, you've got what you need. What's up? These are the conversations we want to have. What will be the right time? Curious, compassionate inquiry, where you and the person who is change resistant are essentially sitting side by side, observing their resistance together and saying, right, what have we missed here? Is it, and a lot of the time it can be, have we missed the fact that you are someone who tends to procrastinate? Is that something you want to work on in general, etc.? It doesn't all have to be about this one thing. And it's always very compelling when people see that habit change is an entry point to learning a bunch of other tools. And that makes it compelling even when they haven't necessarily wanted or chosen to change this particular routine or habit. If you say, look, this is just the one you're going to use to learn how to do hard things and identify whether you keep pushing things off, framing it that way can make it compelling even for people who wouldn't have necessarily done it anyway. Next, please. When in doubt. This is incredibly important. When I talk about, I feel like I've said that a lot of times, but I really do feel a lot of these things are integral. So when my work, I see a lot of it is when I look at change resistance and helping people to understand why it is that they're finding it hard to change. I think it's essentially about trying to close the gap between what they wish for and how they speak about and support the people that they love, and how they're behaving towards themselves. Now, whether that's the way they speak to themselves in the pursuit of doing something difficult or introducing a new habit, whether it's the way they speak to themselves when they fall off track, which invariably means that there's an extended period of time of like beating yourself up and all of those kinds of things. But ultimately, it's about saying, if you were coaching someone else to do what you're trying to do now, and they really wanted to do it too, if you know what you would tell them to do, you know that you would factor in the difficulty, you know that you would comfort them, you know that in the, if they went off track a couple of weeks or they went on holiday or they lost momentum, you wouldn't tell them, well, all is lost, there wasn't any point anyway, just like when you were 10 years old. You know that if they had a blip early on, when they were trying to make this a habit and work around their lives, that you would remind them that they're iterating something, they're trying something new, that it's admirable that they're doing it at all of these kinds of things. And so ultimately, a lot of this comes back to how much we care about the way we behave when no one's watching, and what conversation we're having with ourselves when we need a pep talk, when we need to be brought back on track. And when I started, when I wrote my first book and I started doing masterclasses, I would ask people to write down the name of someone that they love and assume that that person is trying to build a new routine that they're finding difficult, but is in their best interest and they want to do it, much like the conversation we're having today. And I tell them, imagine this person can't start, or they've had a bunch of false starts, or they're falling off, or they've deviated and they don't want to spiral. What would you say to them to keep them on track? And I don't know, the first 1,000 times I did that exercise, people would always say the same things, like, well, I would write down my daughter, I would write down my friend. And if they were trying to do the difficult thing that I'm doing, then I'd say, well, of course you're going to find it difficult. I'd be reasonable. I'd give them common sense. I would support them. And then we would compare that to the way that we often speak to ourselves and notice that there's a gulf. But after a while, I started saying, even if it was someone you hated and I paid you to motivate them, there is no way that in those moments where they didn't do something perfectly, that you would tell them, well, it's just like you were when you were 10 years old and you may as well give up now anyway. And this whole, changing your commute thing wasn't going to work out anyway. It's just not helpful. And so whilst it may seem inauthentic at first, it can be compelling to say, look, if you talk yourself into the hard bit, like a really peppy motivational coach, it might seem fake, but it's almost definitely going to be more effective than defaulting back onto, well, I was never going to do this anyway. This is too hard. This isn't going to work out. Because a lot of the time, we're not just being unkind to ourselves. We're also not accessing common sense. Like, that if you started something, it would be hard at the beginning, and that you have the permission to adapt it as you like, and all of these other things. And so I think more and more what you want to be doing is saying, what's the difference between what I'd recommend that someone else would do and how I would encourage them to stay on track, and how would I encourage them and give them the flexibility and permission to create their own plans on their own terms and keep iterating them until they suited them. Why am I feeling that I'm not receiving the same thing. And a nice little check you can do on the spot if you're ever wondering, like, should I be doing this? It's hard. And people often ask me this because I speak to a lot of people about things like comfort eating. And of course, identifying the kind choice. Having written a book called The Kindness Method, people often ask me, how is it the kind choice to do the difficult thing? How do I identify between, dealing with the discomfort of change and factoring it in, and just being cruel to myself and not realizing that this isn't something I should be doing, or it's the wrong fit, which I think is a really legitimate and fantastic question. And this is what I always say: in the moment of challenge, if you want to identify what the kind choice is, you want to ask yourself, will I be glad that I made this choice when I look back on this tomorrow? Would I advise someone I love to make this choice that I'm about to make? And would I make this choice if someone that I respected was watching? And when you do, what will happen is that you will be able to see that your resistance is not from a place of external practical resistance, and is often from a place of more broadly needing to work more on self-compassion, self-belief, and self-awareness, and the fundamentals that remind you that ultimately all behavioral change is the conversation that you have with yourself and the choice that you make straight afterwards. Next slide, please. And that is the kindness method. So more and more, what I really want to wrap up with is that when people aren't changing and they have everything that they need, the conversation to be had with them is a really curious one, a really curious, compassionate one, which assumes that there might be something personal going on that you may never know about, but to hand them the tools to do a self-inquiry for that can help enormously, not just in this domain of their lives, but in a much more compelling way, I think, for the individual across their entire lives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shahroo. Some really powerful takeaways there. I've written down: take the pressure off the outcome and focus in on what's the next best choice, and get people excited about doing hard things on purpose. Like, those really hit hard. So yeah, really looking